There are two learners who both study English for 1 hour every single day. One of them makes noticeable progress every few weeks. The other studies just as hard, sometimes even harder, and yet feels stuck in almost the exact same place for months. The difference between them is almost never talent. It is almost never intelligence. The difference is how they are spending that hour. Today we are going to talk about why more hours of studying does not automatically mean more progress, and what actually separates efficient learning from wasted effort. This is a topic that rarely gets discussed directly in most English courses, because most courses are focused on delivering content, more vocabulary, more grammar rules, more practice exercises, rather than teaching you how to actually learn that content in the most effective way possible. As a result, many learners assume that if their progress feels slow, the solution must simply be more effort, more hours, more material covered. Sometimes that is true, but very often, the real issue has nothing to do with effort at all, and everything to do with strategy, and today's video is entirely focused on that strategy side of the equation. Let's start with a simple but important idea. Not all study time is equal. An hour spent passively rereading a grammar textbook you have already read 3 times before produces far less real progress than an hour spent actively using English in a way that challenges you slightly beyond your current comfort zone. This is not just a motivational idea. It reflects something real about how learning actually works in the brain. Learning happens most effectively when you are engaging with material that is challenging but manageable, not too easy, and not overwhelmingly difficult. If something is too easy, your brain barely has to work, and very little new learning actually happens, even though you are technically spending time on the language. If something is far too difficult, your brain cannot make sense of it at all, and again, very little useful learning happens, because there is nothing solid to connect the new information to. The most effective learning happens in the middle zone, often called the zone of productive struggle. This is where the material is difficult enough to require real effort and attention, but not so difficult that you feel completely lost. A huge number of English learners unknowingly spend most of their study time either too far below this zone, repeating material they have already mastered because it feels comfortable and safe, or too far above it, consuming content that is so difficult they understand very little of it, which can feel productive because it is challenging, but often is not because too little actually gets absorbed. So the first major shift toward learning smarter is learning to recognize this zone for yourself, and deliberately spending more of your limited study time inside it. If you are reading or listening to something and understanding nearly everything effortlessly, that content is probably too easy to produce much new learning, even if it still feels good and familiar. If you are reading or listening to something and understanding almost nothing, that content is probably too difficult right now to be genuinely useful, even though it might feel impressive or ambitious to attempt it. The sweet spot is content where you understand most of it, but regularly encounter new words, structures, or ideas that stretch your current ability, just slightly. A simple practical guideline many learners find useful is aiming for content where you understand somewhere between 70 and 90% without help. This range is difficult enough to teach you something new consistently, while still being understandable enough that you are not lost and frustrated the entire time. If you find yourself understanding nearly 100% of something, it is probably time to move to slightly more challenging material. If you are understanding less than half, it might be worth stepping back to something a bit easier for now, and returning to the harder material later, once your skills have grown a bit further. The second major idea behind learning smarter is the concept of active recall versus passive review. Passive review means simply looking at information again, rereading notes, rewatching a lesson, or looking over a vocabulary list you have seen many times before. It feels productive because the information feels familiar and easy to follow. But familiarity is deceptive. Recognizing a word when you see it does not mean you can actually produce that same word later on your own without it being right in front of you. Active recall means deliberately trying to retrieve information from memory without looking at the source material first. This could mean covering up a vocabulary list and trying to say each word's meaning from memory before checking. It could mean trying to explain a grammar rule out loud in your own words without looking at your notes and only checking afterward to see how accurate you were. This process feels noticeably harder than passive review, and that difficulty is exactly the point. The mental effort involved in actively retrieving information is what strengthens memory and makes that information easier to access later, especially in real-time situations like actual conversations, where you will not have your notes in front of you. This is one of the most well-established findings in learning research generally, not just for language learning specifically. Active recall consistently produces stronger, longer-lasting memory than passive review, even though passive review often feels easier and more comfortable in the moment. If you take away just one idea from today's video, let it be this. Whenever possible, replace passive rereading with active retrieval. Instead of looking at a list of new words one more time, close the list and try to recall them from memory first. Instead of rewatching a grammar explanation, try to explain the rule yourself out loud, then check how accurate you were. The third idea is spaced repetition, which works closely alongside active recall. Spaced repetition means reviewing information at increasing intervals over time, rather than trying to learn something once and moving on permanently, or reviewing the exact same material every single day without any real strategy behind the timing. Human memory naturally fades over time if information is not revisited, but the interesting part is that each time you successfully recall something just before you would have otherwise forgotten it, that memory becomes significantly stronger and takes even longer to fade the next time. This means the ideal review schedule for a new word or grammar point is not reviewing it constantly every single day, which wastes time reviewing something you already remember well, and it is also not reviewing it only once and never again, which guarantees you will eventually forget it completely. The ideal approach is reviewing shortly after first learning something, then again a few days later, then again roughly a week later, then again after a few weeks, gradually increasing the gap each time you successfully recall it. This spaced pattern takes advantage of how memory naturally works, strengthening retention efficiently without wasting time on unnecessary repetition of things you already know well. You do not need a complicated system to benefit from this idea. Even a simple habit of briefly reviewing new vocabulary the next day, then again after a few days, then again after a week or two, produces dramatically better long-term retention than learning something once and never intentionally revisiting it. Many learners intuitively try to review everything every day, which feels thorough, but is actually a very inefficient use of limited study time compared to a properly spaced approach. The fourth idea is what I call learning in complete chunks rather than isolated pieces, which we have touched on briefly in an earlier video in this series, but which deserves a deeper explanation on its own. A huge amount of study time gets wasted learning individual words in isolation, disconnected from any real context or usage pattern. This produces a strange kind of knowledge where you technically know a word's definition, but you have no real sense of how, when, or with what other words it naturally gets used in actual English. Learning in chunks means learning words and phrases together with their natural context, the words that typically surround them, the grammatical patterns they usually appear in, and the situations where they are commonly used. Instead of learning the isolated word make along with its dictionary definition, you learn complete, natural chunks like make a decision, make progress, make sense, and make an effort, absorbing not just the word itself, but the specific, natural ways it actually gets combined with other words in real English. This approach is significantly more efficient than isolated vocabulary learning because it teaches you multiple things simultaneously: the individual word, its common collocations, and natural sentence patterns, all at once, rather than requiring you to separately learn vocabulary and then separately figure out through trial and error how that vocabulary actually gets used correctly in real sentences later on. The fifth idea is prioritizing frequency over completeness. English contains an enormous number of words, but a relatively small percentage of those words account for the overwhelming majority of everyday spoken and written communication. Many learners waste significant study time memorizing rare, obscure, or highly specialized vocabulary long before they have solidly mastered the much smaller set of extremely common words and phrases that would actually give them the biggest improvement in real-world communication ability. Learning smarter means prioritizing high-frequency vocabulary and grammar structures first, the words and patterns you will actually encounter and need constantly in everyday conversation, before spending significant time on rarer, more specialized material that you might only need occasionally, if ever. This does not mean rare or advanced vocabulary is never worth learning. It simply means sequencing your learning efficiently, building a strong foundation of frequently used language first, since that foundation gives you the most practical benefit for the amount of time invested, before gradually expanding into less common territory as your overall level continues to grow. Let me give you a concrete sense of what this looks like in practice, because it helps to see the difference rather than just hearing about it abstractly. Imagine two learners, both spending 30 minutes on vocabulary each day. The first learner opens a long alphabetical word list and works through it in order, encountering rare and common words mixed together randomly, simply because that happens to be the order they appear in the list, spending equal time on a word like ubiquitous as on a word like however. Even though one of these will appear constantly in daily conversation and the other might come up only rarely. The second learner instead works from material based on actual usage frequency, starting with the words and phrases that show up constantly in everyday conversation, articles, connecting words, common verbs, and the phrases built around them. After a few months, the second learner is noticeably more functional in daily conversation, not because they know more total words, but because the specific words they know are the ones they actually need constantly, while the first learner may know a few more impressive or unusual words, but still struggles with basic everyday communication because their limited time was spent less strategically. This does not mean frequency lists are the only valid way to choose what to study, and it certainly does not mean advanced or specialized vocabulary is not worth learning eventually. It simply illustrates why sequencing matters as much as total effort. The same 30 minutes a day, spent differently, produces very different practical results after the same amount of total time invested. The sixth and final idea I want to cover today is interleaving, which means mixing different types of practice together within a single study session, rather than spending an entire session focused on just one narrow skill or topic. For example, instead of spending an entire hour only on grammar exercises, or an entire hour only on vocabulary memorization, a more effective session might include a shorter period of vocabulary review, followed by some grammar practice, followed by a short speaking exercise like the ones covered in our previous video, followed by a bit of reading or listening. This might seem less focused than dedicating a full session to one single skill, but interleaving different types of practice actually strengthens learning more effectively than long blocks of single skill practice, because it forces your brain to repeatedly switch between different types of thinking and retrieval, which more closely resembles the way you will actually need to use English in real situations, where grammar, vocabulary, listening, and speaking all get used together constantly, not in isolated, separate blocks. Now, let's bring all 6 of these ideas together into something practical you can actually use starting today. When you sit down to study English, ask yourself whether the material you are using sits inside that productive struggle zone, challenging but manageable, rather than something either too easy or too overwhelming. Whenever possible, replace passive review with active recall, testing yourself before checking the answer, rather than simply rereading information you have already seen. Build a simple habit of reviewing new material at increasing intervals over time, rather than either cramming everything daily or reviewing something once and forgetting about it. Learn new vocabulary in complete, natural chunks alongside its common usage patterns, rather than as isolated words with dictionary definitions. Prioritize the most frequently used vocabulary and grammar structures first, before spending significant time on rarer, more specialized material. And mix different types of practice together within your study sessions, rather than spending an entire session narrowly focused on just one single skill. None of these ideas require you to study for more hours than you already are. In fact, many learners find that applying these principles allows them to study for less total time while still making faster, more noticeable progress, simply because that time is being used far more efficiently than before. This is genuinely encouraging news if you have ever felt guilty or discouraged about not having enough hours in your day to dedicate to English study. The goal is never to find more hours. The goal is to make the hours you already have count for significantly more than they currently do. It is also worth saying clearly that none of these 6 ideas require any special app, paid course, or expensive resource to start using. You can apply the productive struggle zone the next time you choose an article or video to study with. You can apply active recall the next time you review a vocabulary list, simply by covering the answers first. You can apply spaced repetition with nothing more than a simple note reminding yourself when to revisit something. These are shifts in how you use the resources you already have, not a request to buy or download anything new, which means you can start applying all of this starting with your very next study session, today, without waiting for anything else to change first. Tomorrow, we're going to shift focus once again and talk about building real listening skills for fast, natural, native speed English, the kind used in everyday conversation rather than the slower, clearer English often used in language learning materials, and why this particular skill often lags behind reading comprehension for so many learners, even those who consider themselves fairly advanced. If today's video helped you see your own study habits a little differently, that awareness alone is a meaningful first step, because now you can start noticing in real time whether a given study session is genuinely inside that productive struggle zone, or whether it has quietly slipped into comfortable but ultimately less useful territory. Let us know in the comments which of today's 6 ideas felt most relevant to how you currently study. This is day 5 of English Rewired's 10-day English series, and I will see you tomorrow for day 6.